Susan stood in front of a large mirror in the bridal shop, her heart fluttering with excitement as she admired herself in the beautiful white wedding dress. This was the dress she would wear in just 2 days when she would marry Stephen, the man she thought she loved. Her best friend, Clara, was beside her, smiling and chatting about how wonderful the wedding would be. As Susan twirled slightly in the dress, imagining the joy of her upcoming wedding, the door of the shop suddenly swung open. She turned around, expecting to see Stephen with a loving smile, but instead, her heart stopped. Stephen walked in, not alone, but with another woman. Before Susan could react, Stephen leaned in and kissed the woman right there in front of her. "Susan!" Clara gasped, her voice filled with shock. Susan felt her world shatter. The man she was supposed to marry had just betrayed her in the most blatant way possible. Her mind raced, struggling to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But she refused to cry. Not here, not now. She walked out of the dressing room, her heart pounding, and faced Stephen, who had finally noticed her presence. His face turned pale as he realized what he had done. "Susan, wait, I can explain," Stephen stammered, rushing toward her. "Explain?" Susan's voice trembled with both hurt and fury. "You're kissing another woman 2 days before our wedding, and you want to explain?" "It was just a mistake, Susan. An accident." Stephen's voice was desperate. "An accident? Did your lips just accidentally find hers?" Susan snapped, her anger now fully taking over her hurt. "You've betrayed me, Stephen." "Susan, listen to me. We've planned this wedding for months. Our parents have spent so much money. You can't just walk away now," Stephen pleaded, trying to regain control. Susan felt the weight of his words. It was true. Her parents had invested a lot in this wedding, and she knew they were counting on it to go smoothly. They had always been concerned about their family's reputation and standing in society. A wedding like this, with all its grandeur, was a symbol of their success. Backing out now would not only disappoint them, but could also lead to a fallout with Stephen's influential family. "I'll get married, Stephen, but not to you," Susan declared, her voice firm as she shook off the pressure. "And who are you going to marry in 2 days? A stranger off the street?" Stephen sneered, thinking she was bluffing. "If that's what it takes, yes," Susan shouted back. And without looking at him again, she stormed out of the shop, her mind spinning with thoughts of what to do next. As she walked briskly through the bustling streets of New York, Susan felt a mix of anger, fear, and desperation. The weight of her decision was heavy, but she knew she couldn't go back to Stephen. She needed to get away from him and the situation, but how? Then, as if fate had intervened, she saw a man struggling to carry a large box of peaches outside a small grocery store. He had a gentle face, and something about him seemed trustworthy. Without giving herself time to reconsider, she walked up to him. "Excuse me, are you married?" Susan asked, her voice shaky but determined. The man looked up, surprised by the unexpected question. "No, I'm not," he replied, still confused. "Why do you ask?" "Would you like to make $100,000? Susan asked, her eyes filled with desperation. The man's surprise turned to cautious interest. "Who wouldn't?" he replied, now curious about what she was proposing. "Marry me today, and I'll transfer the money to your bank account tonight," Susan said, her eyes pleading with him to understand her urgency. The man smiled slightly, realizing she wasn't joking. "My name is Ajit," he said, his voice calm. Are you sure about this? You don't know me." Susan hesitated for a moment, realizing how crazy her request sounded, but she had no other choice. The pressure from her family, the humiliation she felt, and her desire to escape this nightmare were too overwhelming. "Yes, I'm sure," Susan said, her voice steady now. "I need to get away from someone who has hurt me, and I need to do it fast." Before Ajit could respond, Stephen appeared out of nowhere, his face twisted in anger. "What are you doing, Susan? Get over here right now," he demanded, his voice loud and commanding. But before Susan could react, Ajit stepped between them, his expression calm but firm. "Get your hands off my future wife," he said, his voice steady and protective. Susan looked at Ajit, shocked by his sudden bravery. She had only just met this man, but he was already standing up for her in a way Stephen never had. Stephen sneered. "Marry a street vendor, Susan? Really? You're making a mistake." Susan felt a surge of anger and courage. "It's better than marrying a cheater," she retorted, her voice strong and clear. "You won't get away from me that easily, Susan." "You know that?" Stephen hissed before storming off, leaving Susan and Ajit standing there. Susan turned to Ajit, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "Will you really marry me?" she asked softly. Ajit looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, I will. Let's get you out of this mess," he said gently. They quickly went to City Hall, where it took only a short time to get married. With 2 simple rings and a few signatures, Susan and Ajit were now husband and wife. Susan felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. She had no idea what the future held, but at least she was free from Stephen. Ajit led Susan to his apartment, a cozy space filled with warmth and the smell of fresh peaches. The walls were adorned with colorful paintings, and the furniture was a mix of comfortable and practical. It was a far cry from the cold, impersonal luxury of Stephen's apartment. "Welcome to my home," Ajit said, with a shy smile as he opened the door for Susan. Susan looked around, feeling oddly at ease in this new environment. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Touched by the cozy atmosphere, Ajit guided her to a small but comfortable couch, offering her a seat. "I understand that you're angry and hurt right now, but you don't have to do this," he said gently. "You're a smart, kind, and beautiful woman. You deserve more than to marry someone just to escape another man." Susan sighed, her emotions finally catching up with her. "I know," she admitted, "but I felt trapped, like there was no other way out." Ajit nodded, understanding. "Well, you're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out together." As the evening wore on, Susan found herself opening up to Ajit. They talked about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Ajit's kindness and easygoing nature began to chip away at the walls Susan had built around her heart. Susan shared more about the immense pressure she felt from her family. Her parents were highly respected in their community, and the wedding had become more than just a union of 2 people. It was a symbol of their family's status. The thought of canceling the wedding and facing her parents' disappointment had been unbearable, driving her to desperate measures. Ajit listened patiently, offering words of comfort and understanding. He didn't judge her for the choices she had made. Instead, he reassured her that it was okay to take control of her life in the way that felt right for her. Just as Susan was beginning to feel comfortable, the front door creaked open and Ajit's parents walked in. His mother, a petite woman with sharp eyes, looked at Susan with clear disapproval. His father, taller and more reserved, frowned as he took in the scene. "Who is this?" Ajit's father asked, his voice stern. Ajit straightened, his expression determined. "This is Susan, my wife." "Wife? Are you serious?" Ajit's mother exclaimed, her voice rising in pitch. "She's not one of us. This is absurd." Ajit held up his hand to calm them. "Please, just give her a chance. She's going through a difficult time, and she needs our support." But his parents were far from convinced. "You need to annul this marriage immediately," his father insisted, crossing his arms. Susan felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She didn't want to cause problems for Ajit and his family. But before she could say anything, Ajit spoke up. "I'm not annulling anything," Ajit said firmly. "I promised to take care of Susan, and I intend to keep that promise." His parents exchanged a look, clearly unhappy, but unsure how to respond. Finally, they turned and left the room, leaving Susan and Ajit alone once again. After the tense encounter with Ajit's parents, Susan felt emotionally drained. She followed Ajit to the small garden behind the apartment, where the evening air was cool and the smell of peaches filled the space. The garden was simple but well kept, with a few blooming flowers and a small bench under a peach tree. "I'm sorry about my parents," Ajit said, handing Susan a ripe peach. "They just need time to understand." "It's okay," Susan replied, taking the peach. "Thank you for standing up for me." Ajit smiled. "I meant what I said. I'll take care of you, no matter what." As they ate peaches together, Susan felt a warmth in her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. The bitterness and anger she had felt earlier were slowly melting away, replaced by something new, hope. As the days passed, Susan and Ajit spent more time together, getting to know each other. Ajit's humor and kindness made her laugh, and his patience gave her the space she needed to heal. Susan began to see Ajit not just as a friend, but as someone she could possibly love. But just as Susan was beginning to feel at home in her new life, Ajit came to her with news that made her heart sink. "I have to leave for a while," Ajit said, his tone apologetic. "Where are you going?" Susan asked, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. "There's something I need to take care of," Ajit explained, "but I'll be back soon, I promise." Susan nodded, but as she watched him leave, a sense of loneliness washed over her. She didn't know why, but she already missed him. Several hours passed, and Ajit still hadn't returned. Susan sat alone in the garden, her mind racing. What if he didn't come back? What if he had left her too? The fear of being abandoned again began to gnaw at her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar, unwelcome voice. "Waiting for someone?" Stephen sneered as he stepped into the garden, his presence instantly making Susan's heart sink. Susan turned to face him, her expression hardening. "What are you doing here, Stephen?" Stephen smirked, his eyes cold. "Is your new husband going to leave you out here all alone? You should have stayed with me, Susan. I can offer you security, a future. Even if Ajit doesn't come back, it's none of your business," Susan replied, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "You're so naive, Susan. He's not coming back. Come on, let's go home," Stephen urged, reaching out as if to take her hand. But before Susan could respond, Ajit's voice rang out. "Take your hands off my wife," Ajit said as he walked into the garden, holding a small box. Susan's eyes widened in surprise. "Ajit, I thought you left me. Where have you been?" "I was looking for the perfect ring for you," Ajit said, opening the box to reveal a sparkling diamond ring. "My wife deserves the best." Susan gasped. "A diamond? But how?" Before Ajit could explain, Stephen interrupted. "He probably stole it. How else would a street vendor afford a diamond ring?" Ajit shook his head. "I'm not just a street vendor, Susan. I own a restaurant. I was helping out with the peaches because I love to serve the best desserts to my customers." Susan stared at Ajit, speechless. All this time, she had no idea who Ajit really was. Ajit took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. "I told you I'd take care of you, no matter what." At that moment, Susan realized that she had found something much more valuable than money or security. She had found true love. Stephen, seeing that he had lost, turned and walked away, leaving them alone in the peaceful garden. As Ajit held her close, Susan realized that she had found someone who truly cared for her, someone she could trust. In Ajit's arms, she knew she had found true love. And there, under the soft glow of the garden lights, with the scent of peaches all around, Susan and Ajit began their new life together, knowing that this was just the start of a beautiful story, a story of love, trust, and a future they would build together.